What if the one person who was supposed to be your protector became your captor? And what if, when every human door had closed, salvation arrived not with a voice but with four hooves and a silent, knowing gaze? The story you are about to hear might stretch the limits of what you believe is possible. Imagine an elderly mother, tormented by her own son, left broken on the cold ground. And then, appearing from the coastal mist, a magnificent horse with no rider and no reins, facing down the man who had caused so much pain. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a raw, powerful account of what can happen when faith refuses to die. Because sometimes, when humanity turns its back, a higher power sends an angel in a form we least expect. If you've ever felt invisible, forgotten, or hurt by someone who should have loved you, stay with me. This story holds a message your heart needs to hear. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story that speaks directly to the soul. It was one of those afternoons in the coastal village of Port Blossom, where the sea salt seemed to hang permanently in the air, clinging to every stone and window pane. The sky was a vast, unforgiving grey, pressing down on the slate roofs and making the cold seep through the cracks of the old cottages as if it had a will of its own. Here time didn't just move slowly, it felt weathered, worn down by the constant rhythm of the tides. A few gulls cried mournfully overhead, and a stray cat, thin as a whip, slunk through the shadows of a fishing boat long since abandoned on the shingle. In a small stone cottage named Seadrift, perched precariously close to the cliffs, a woman of nearly 80 years, with skin as pale and translucent as parchment, was slowly sweeping the stone floor. Her name was Elspeth Croft. Her silver hair was plaited into a single, thin braid that lay over a shoulder as frail as a bird's wing. Her eyes, a once vibrant sea blue, were now faded by years and sorrow, but they still held a quiet, defiant strength that refused to complain. She wore a faded, burgundy cardigan, frayed at the cuffs, over a simple floral dress that brushed against her worn slippers. She said she liked to feel the chill of the stones through the thin soles. It reminded her she was still standing. But on this particular afternoon, more than the cold of the floor, she felt the immense weight of her years, of the suffocating silence, and most of all, of the son she had once held in her arms, who had now stolen her voice, her freedom, and even her right to be seen. From the other room, a heavy thud echoed as a door was slammed shut. The cat outside darted away, the gulls fell silent, and Elspeth froze, the broom still in her hands, as if that sound was a harbinger of a storm she knew all too well. "Where is it?" A deep, guttural voice, laced with impatience, cut through the quiet. "Doing nothing again, are you? Useless." Alistair Croft, her only son, had returned from wherever it was he went. He was 38, but the deep lines etched on his forehead and the darkness that swam in his eyes made him look a decade older. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, with a thick, untrimmed beard and dark hair that was perpetually damp from the sea mist. His hands were calloused from a life he once had on the fishing boats, but his soul, she feared, was calloused by something far deeper and colder. Elspeth swallowed, the sound loud in the silence. "It's on the table, son. Though it's probably gone cold by now." "Cold tea? Is that what I work my fingers to the bone for?" "Cold tea," he sneered, shoving a wooden chair so hard it scraped violently against the stone floor. The air grew tight, charged with a familiar, dangerous energy. Elspeth retreated back into the small kitchen, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on the floor. She knew that any misplaced glance, any word misinterpreted, could end in a shove, a torrent of verbal abuse, or worse. She just couldn't understand how the small boy who used to curl up on her chest, terrified of the thunder, had transformed into the very storm she now feared. Was it the loss of his father to the sea? The decline of the fishing trade? The gnawing poverty? She didn't know. And though her mother's heart couldn't find the answers, it also couldn't stop loving him. "You're useless," he muttered again, seeing a few drops of spilled tea on the table. In a flash of rage, the mug flew across the room, shattering against the stone wall into 1,000 pieces, like tiny, broken promises. Without a word, without a tear, Elspeth bent down to pick up the shards. Each piece of broken ceramic felt like another fragment of her own dignity, scattered across the floor of the home that had once echoed with laughter. "I'm sorry, Alistair," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll make you a fresh cup tomorrow." But he wasn't listening. He had already stormed out the back door, cursing at the grey, indifferent sky. When the silence returned, heavier than before, Elspeth sat on a small wooden stool by a window that looked out onto her small, wind-battered garden. From a pocket sewn into the lining of her dress, she pulled out a tiny, well-worn Bible, its cover soft as cloth. She opened it without needing to look, her fingers knowing the path to the Psalms by heart. She closed her eyes. Her lips moved, forming silent words. She wasn't praying for herself. She was praying for him. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the edges of the thick clouds with a faint watercolor pink. And in that moment, a memory ambushed her, Alistair, as a little boy, running along the cliff path, his arms outstretched, laughing into the wind. Where had that laughter gone? A distant sound, like a deep rumbling, pulled her from her thoughts. It wasn't thunder. The sky was still. It sounded almost like hooves on a distant road. "Lord, if you can still see me," she prayed, "send a sign. Not for me. For him. For my son." The hours crawled by. At night, when the temperature dropped even further, Elspeth lit a single, flickering candle in front of a small, faded picture of a lighthouse that hung in the hallway. The flame danced and sputtered, as if it, too, was hesitant to stay alight in this house where everything felt like it was on the verge of being extinguished. For her supper, she had a piece of stale bread and a cup of water. She lay down on her thin mattress on the floor, pulling a threadbare blanket over herself. She didn't have a proper bed. She'd sold the old frame years ago to buy Alistair a sturdy pair of work boots. He wouldn't remember that. But she did. There was a small crack in the ceiling through which she could see a sliver of the moon. And in the profound quiet of the cottage, Elspeth whispered one last prayer into the cold air. "Please, Lord, don't forget me." In the next room, Alistair's heavy snores filled the darkness. His dirty work coat hung from a nail on the wall. Beside it, an empty bottle of cheap whiskey had rolled onto the floor. The night settled over Port Blossom like a heavy shroud. No one heard Elspeth's long, weary sigh. No one knew how utterly alone her soul felt in that moment. And no one could have imagined that the very next day, the heavens would answer in a way that would change everything forever. But for now, she slept, and though her bones ached with a deep, weary pain, her faith flickered on, a tiny, stubborn flame. Because there was one thing Alistair couldn't take from her, not with his shouts, not with his cruelty, not with his contempt. And that was the hope that one day God would speak again. And he would do so with the sound of a horse's gallop. The sun had barely begun to pierce the thick morning mist that rolled in from the sea over Port Blossom. Already, the sounds of the village were beginning to stir, the chugging of the first fishing boat heading out, the clink of milk bottles on doorsteps, the distant cry of girls fighting over a discarded crust of bread. It was a morning like any other in this forgotten corner of the coast, where women in thick cardigans swept their stone steps and gossiped about the weather. But inside the damp, cold cottage marked by a faded wooden sign that read Seadrift, the new day brought no promise of warmth or peace. Elspeth Croft, a woman whose small frame housed a spirit of immense resilience, opened her eyes long before the first light, her body trained by years of habit to anticipate the inevitable. The inside of the cottage was dark, not because the sun hadn't risen, but because Alistair had bolted the front door from the inside the night before. It wasn't the first time. It was a ritual he justified with gruff words like, "It's for your own safety. Don't want you wandering off." But Elspeth knew it wasn't about protection, it was about possession. It was a cage. The old woman, her feet bare against the cold stone, made her way slowly to the small, soot-stained hearth, where she placed a small pot of water to warm. The kindling crackled and hissed reluctantly. Her stooped back and swollen joints forced her to move with a painful deliberation. On the mantelpiece sat a single, faded photograph, a much younger Elspeth, holding a baby Alistair, her eyes full of a future she couldn't have imagined would curdle into this. A future where she was now a prisoner in her own home. "Good morning, my lord," she whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air as she lit her single candle. "You know what it's like to watch a child in pain, and to have to remain silent." From the adjacent room, the heavy thud of Alistair's feet hitting the floorboards announced his waking. The creak of his door, followed by a harsh, guttural cough, signaled that the warden of her prison was now awake. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, he wore the same uniform as always, a deep scowl, downcast eyes, and shoulders tensed as if bracing for a fight. "Is breakfast ready?" She had barely managed to heat the water. "I was just about to make you some porridge, son." "Porridge is for invalids." "I want eggs," he snapped without looking at her. "And be quick about it. I've got things to do." Elspeth's gaze dropped to the floor as she swallowed the lump in her throat. "There are no eggs, Alistair. Mr. Finn didn't get his delivery yesterday." He grunted, slamming his fist on the small wooden table. The pot of water jumped on the hearth. He didn't shout this time, but his silence was a coiled serpent, far more menacing. He turned on his heel and went back to his room, and the slam of his door was like a judge's gavel. Life outside her stone walls went on. Children were chanting a skipping rhyme in the lane, their voices bright and clear. Two neighbors were chatting over a garden wall, their colorful headscarves a stark contrast to the grey day. No one imagined that behind those thick, salt-stained walls, a woman was living in an invisible prison with no bars or guards, but with chains wrapped tight around her very soul. Because although she had a roof over her head, she wasn't safe. Although she had a son, she was desperately alone. And although she was still breathing, there were many days she felt she wasn't truly alive. "You are not to go out. People talk and I won't be the subject of village gossip," Alistair had told her time and time again. One day, a kind neighbor, Mrs. Gable, had knocked insistently at the door. "Elspeth, dear, are you all right? I've brought you a bit of fruitcake." Elspeth had rushed towards the door, her heart leaping at the simple gesture of kindness. But before she could even touch the bolt, Alistair's voice boomed from within. "We don't need anything from anyone. Go away." The old woman froze, feeling a single, hot tear trace a path down her weathered cheek. Not for the cake, not even for her neighbor, but because for one fleeting second, she had felt like she wasn't alone, and that feeling had been snatched away. "Thank you, Martha," she murmured through the thick oak door, her voice trembling. "God bless you." On the other side, the neighbor didn't reply. She just left the small, foil-wrapped cake on the doorstep and hurried away. Alistair appeared, his eyes blazing. "How many times have I told you not to talk to the neighbors? Do you want everyone thinking I'm some kind of monster?" "I didn't say anything, son. She came on her own. Don't lie to me." The blow didn't come from his hand, but from his words. Because words strike just as hard. Words shatter. Words inflict a pain that never truly heals. Elspeth recoiled, feeling her own body shrink, but she didn't cry. Not in front of him. She had a silent pact with her own dignity. The tears were reserved for the dead of night when no one could see her, when she could huddle in the corner of her room clutching her old Bible as if it were a shield. And there, in that self-imposed darkness, she would pray, "Lord, if I have no strength left, lend me yours. If I can no longer speak, speak for me. And if no one else sees me, I know that you do." What was incredible was that even in this prison, Elspeth didn't hate her son. She understood a part of his pain. She knew he had grown up with anger, with a sense of loss, with wounds that had never healed. But it didn't excuse what he did. Sometimes she thought that Alistair's real punishment wasn't one that could be handed down by any court, it was that he had simply forgotten how to love. That night, like so many others, he bolted the door and pocketed the only key. Elspeth just sighed, said nothing, and lay down on her mattress, staring up at the cracked ceiling. The moon peeked through a gap, painting her face in its pale, ethereal light. Suddenly, she heard it again, a distant sound, like a slow, heavy gallop. A horse. But there hadn't been any workhorses in Port Blossom for years. She sat up, straining her ears. It was unmistakable. A gallop. She got up, went to the small, grimy window, and peered through the salt-stained glass. There was nothing but the gnarled old rowan tree, its branches writhing in the wind. She went back to her mattress, her heart beating a little faster. Something had shifted inside her that night. Something she hadn't felt for a very, very long time. Hope. A hope so quiet and gentle, it was like God whispering in the midst of her captivity. Because even the darkest prison cannot lock away faith. And what Elspeth didn't know yet was that the gallop she had heard wasn't a dream. It was a promise on its way. It was high noon in Port Blossom, and the sun, making a rare and fierce appearance, beat down like a physical punishment on the slate roofs. It made the air shimmer and sent even the hardy seabirds seeking shelter in the shadows of the cliffs. The narrow, cobbled lanes were deserted. Not even the village dogs dared to venture out from beneath the rusting hulks of old cars. The only sounds were the persistent buzz of a bluebottle fly and the faint, dry rustle of the leaves on the ancient rowan tree that stood guard in front of Elspeth Croft's cottage. Inside that house of cold stone and damp wood, Elspeth was bent over the hearth, her body trembling with effort as she tried to lift a small, flat griddle cake from the heat without it crumbling. Her fingers were swollen, her nails were broken, and a sharp, nagging pain shot through her lower back. She wore the same frayed cardigan and floral dress as the days before, the hem of the dress now grey with dust from the floor. Her burgundy cardigan had slipped from one shoulder, but she didn't even notice. Her mind was elsewhere, on the empty cupboards, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, and on the son who would soon be returning. Alistair had left early that morning, quieter than usual, but Elspeth had felt a prickle of unease. She had seen it in the way he'd slammed the door, in the way he'd deliberately avoided her gaze. There was a tightness in her chest, a premonition she couldn't explain. And then the metal garden gate crashed open with a sound that ripped through the stillness. "Where's the money?" Alistair's voice roared from the garden. Elspeth dropped the griddle cake. Her heart leaped into her throat. "What money, son?" she answered, her own voice thin and reedy as she slowly made her way to the back door, towards the blinding glare of the sun. Alistair was standing in the middle of the small, stony patch of garden, his face flushed and beaded with sweat, his eyes bloodshot, and his mouth set in a hard, cruel line. His shirt was unbuttoned, plastered to his chest with perspiration. His face, already hardened by bitterness, now looked as though it were carved from pure rage. "The money I left in my drawer. £50. Where is it?" "I haven't touched a thing, Alistair. I swear on my life, I haven't been in your room." "Liar! You and your pathetic, saintly face," he bellowed, striding towards her, his large frame shaking with fury. Elspeth raised a frail hand, as if to hold back the wind. "Alistair, please don't shout. If something's missing, we'll look for it together." But it was too late. His hand shot out and clamped around her thin upper arm with a grip so tight that a pained whimper escaped her lips. He shoved her backwards against the rough stone wall of the cottage, making her slight body slam against the unyielding surface. "You're stealing from me. After everything, you're stealing from me, you ungrateful old witch." Elspeth put a hand to her head, feeling dizzy. "I would never. I am your mother." And that was the moment everything broke. With a roar of pure, animalistic rage, he grabbed a handful of her thin, silver hair. He clenched his fist in it and began to drag her, pulling her out into the open garden as if she were a sack of rubbish, as if she were no longer his mother but a worthless, discarded object. "You are going to learn not to stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Elspeth's slippers were torn from her feet as she was dragged over the sharp, uneven stones. Her cardigan was left behind on the doorstep, a silent, burgundy witness to the horror. The woman moaned a low, guttural sound, but no tears fell. She just closed her eyes and whispered, "Jesus, my Lord, don't let me go." The neighbors heard. Of course they heard. But no one came out. No one knocked on the gate, no one raised their voice, because in small, forgotten towns, fear is an inheritance passed down through generations. Alistair dragged her to the center of the garden, and then, abruptly, let her go. Elspeth collapsed onto her knees, her face smeared with dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. There was blood on her elbow, her braid had come undone, and an invisible wound burned hotter than any physical blow, wound of knowing she had been so utterly degraded by the very son she had once nursed at her breast. Alistair stood over her, his chest heaving, like a beast that didn't know what to do with so much accumulated rage. "Don't you ever lie to me again, do you hear me?" Elspeth didn't answer. She remained on her knees, her gaze fixed on the hard, unforgiving ground. The midday light was so intense it was difficult to keep her eyes open, but she forced them up towards the sky, and in that moment, lying broken on the earth, she spoke to God with all that was left of her heart. "Father, if you can still see me, send me an angel. Because I can't bear this anymore. I can't do this alone." Alistair turned and stalked back into the house, leaving the door gaping open behind him. Elspeth remained there, under a sun that scorched her skin, her hair a tangled mess, her hands trembling in her lap. A light breeze stirred, sending a single, dry leaf skittering across the stones. And then, for no reason she could name, she lifted her head again. Something was moving at the end of the lane, something that shouldn't be there. It was huge, magnificent, walking with a slow, deliberate confidence. It was a horse. A massive, dapple grey-shire horse, with a mane as black as midnight and a single, perfect white star on its forehead. It was walking slowly, its gaze fixed directly on her. It wore no saddle, no bridle, no harness of any kind. It just advanced, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Elspeth struggled to her feet. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but it was no longer from fear. It was from something larger, deeper certainty, a shiver, an inner voice that said, "You are not alone. He has come for you." The horse stopped a few feet away. It just looked at her. It didn't whinny, it didn't stamp its foot, it just watched her with eyes so deep and ancient that Elspeth felt it was speaking to her without words. And for the first time in a very long time, she wept. Not for the pain, not for the sorrow, but because something deep within her knew, without anyone having to tell her, that this was the answer she had been praying for. The angel hadn't come down from heaven with wings and a trumpet. It had come on 4 legs, with a noble gaze and a sacred silence. And though she didn't know it yet, from that moment on, everything was about to change. The next day's sun rose with the same indifferent power as always, illuminating the slate roofs, the gnarled trees, and the weathered stone lanes of Port Blossom as if nothing had happened. But inside Elspeth Croft's cottage, something had irrevocably shifted. It wasn't the old stone walls, or the dusty floor, or the smell of damp that permeated every corner. It was the silence. It was a different kind of silence now, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting. Elspeth woke up with every bone in her body aching. She could barely move her right arm. Her hair was still tangled with bits of dirt and leaves from the garden. She had fallen asleep in the corner of her room, clutching her Bible, without supper, without a blanket, without anyone to check on her. But as she opened her eyes, one image burned in her memory, the horse. That huge, majestic figure that had stood before her the previous afternoon, as if sent directly from the heavens. I must have imagined it, she thought at first. Or perhaps it wandered from afar. But a quiet certainty in her chest told her otherwise. So, without a word, she rose, adjusted her cardigan with trembling hands, and walked slowly towards the garden, her hope reignited, her soul a quiver. And there it was. standing serenely beside the old rowan tree, as if it were a natural part of the landscape. A massive, dapple grey Shire horse, its coat gleaming even through the dust of the road. Its mane was long and black, its legs powerful, its neck strong, and the white star on its forehead looked as if it had been painted there with purpose. It wore no saddle, no bridle, no rope. And its eyes were the most extraordinary thing. They were large, dark, and filled with a warmth that seemed to look right through her into the very heart of her. Elspeth held her breath. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. She hadn't been dreaming. She wasn't mad. The horse was there. And it was waiting. "Where did you come from, you beautiful creature?" she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. The horse took a single, slow step towards her, without haste, without fear. It didn't make a sound. It just moved closer, slowly, as if it understood it was in the presence of someone broken and hurt, but someone who was still, somehow, standing. Elspeth reached out a trembling hand. She hesitated. She hadn't touched a horse this close in decades. But something inside her, something stronger than her fear, pushed her to connect. "Are you real or are you an angel?" The tips of her fingers brushed against the animal's warm, velvety muzzle. It lowered its great head slightly, accepting her touch. She closed her eyes, and in that simple contact, something shattered inside of her. Or perhaps something was healed. She couldn't explain it. She only knew that for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel alone. "Are you hungry, my handsome boy?" she asked softly, as if speaking to a person. "I don't have much, but I can give you some water. I have a piece of stale bread, too." And so it began. The horse didn't move. It just watched her calmly, patiently, as if it understood every word. Elspeth fetched a small bucket and filled it with water from her rain barrel. She broke up a dry griddle cake into a pan and placed it all near the tree. She wasn't sure if it would eat, but she had to try. From inside the cottage, Alistair was watching through a crack in his window. His brow was furrowed, his jaw clenched. "What in God's name is that beast doing here again?" he muttered to himself. He leaned closer. He saw his mother stroking the horse. He saw her smile, a genuine, gentle smile that he hadn't seen in years, and he felt a familiar fire ignite in his gut. Jealousy, anger, guilt. He didn't know what it was. He only knew that the animal's presence unnerved him, made him feel exposed, as if its silent dignity was a mirror reflecting his own lack of it. "That horse can't stay," he growled to himself, slamming a fist against the windowsill. "There's no room here for useless things." But he didn't go out. Not that day. Meanwhile, Elspeth was talking to the horse as if it were an old friend. She told it simple things: how she'd grown up in this village, how she'd lost her husband to the sea, how she'd raised her son alone on a diet of faith and handmade oatcakes. She spoke of her prayers, her sorrows, and of the days when she thought God had forgotten her completely. "But if you've come from Him," she said, tears of pure gratitude now streaming down her face, "then you tell Him thank you. Thank you for not letting me go. Thank you for sending me a companion." The afternoon slipped by without her noticing. The horse didn't move from her side, nor did it even glance towards the road. It was as if it didn't belong to this world. And as the sun began to dip behind the cliffs, something even stranger happened. A group of children playing in the lane crept up to the garden gate. Mrs. Croft, one of them, a little girl with wide, curious eyes, called out, "Is that your horse?" "No, my dears. I don't know where he came from. He's beautiful. He looks like he's from a storybook." Can I touch him?" the girl asked. "If he'll let you, child. But be gentle." The girl slowly approached. The horse lowered its head. She stroked its nose and let out a little gasp of delight. "His eyes are sad," she said. "Like he understands everything." And without thinking, Elspeth replied, "Perhaps he does. Perhaps that's why he's here." The children ran off, laughing and shouting that they were going to tell their mothers. And just like that, the story of the horse with no owner, who had taken up residence with the old woman on Cliff Lane, began to spread through Port Blossom. But for Elspeth, it wasn't gossip, it wasn't a curiosity. It was a miracle. And although she still didn't know what the future held with this animal, she was sure of one thing. This was no coincidence. This was purpose. This was a sign. Because when God answers, He doesn't always do it with a clap of thunder. Sometimes He does it with a dapple grey horse with noble eyes and a serene step. The night fell over Port Blossom with a rare and gentle peace. The wind whispered softly through the branches of the old rowan tree in the garden, and even the village dogs, usually a restless chorus of barks, were strangely silent. The moon was full and brilliant, so large and low in the sky it seemed to be peering directly into the window of Elspeth Croft's cottage, as if deliberately keeping a watchful eye on her. Inside, Elspeth spread her thin blanket on her mattress on the floor. Her feet were swollen, her fingers ached, and her body was exhausted. But there was something different in her face, a serene tranquility she hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. She had spent the afternoon with the horse, speaking to it as if it were an old confessor, telling it things she hadn't dared to say out loud even to God. And the horse, without a sound, had simply listened with its great, dark eyes, which were full of something Elspeth couldn't quite name. Compassion. Tenderness. Faith. She picked up the candle from its corner and carried it to the window. He was there, lying down beneath the rowan tree, calm and still, as if he knew this was his home. The moonlight fell across his powerful grey back, giving his coat an almost silver sheen. "Good night, my boy," Elspeth whispered to him. "Rest well. I'll bring you some oats in the morning, if I can find some." She made the sign of the cross and lay down to sleep. She closed her eyes. Her body ached, but for the first time in years, her soul felt at peace. And that's when the dream came. But it wasn't an ordinary dream. It wasn't one of those jumbled-up journeys through fuzzy memories and nonsensical voices. No, this was clear, lucid, and sharp. Elspeth found herself standing in her own garden, but everything was transformed. The sky was a soft, golden color, like a perpetual dawn. The air was weightless. There was no pain in her body, no fear in her heart. Before her stood the horse, magnificent, solid, and glowing. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, a figure stood bathed in light. He was tall, dressed in white robes that seemed to move without a breeze. His hands were large and gentle, and though his face was not distinct, his very presence radiated an indescribable peace. The horse lowered its head, and the figure spoke. Its voice was neither male nor female but pure and melodic. Elspeth, it said, your tears have not been in vain. Your prayers have not been lost. I am the one who sent this horse. Not as a punishment but as an answer. Elspeth sunk to her knees in the dream, not from fear, but from a profound sense of reverence. Her chest filled with something she had never felt before, an absolute, unshakable certainty that heaven was listening. Why me? She asked, her voice a whisper. Who am I that you would send such an angel to me? The figure extended a hand and gestured towards the horse. Because there is still purpose in your life. Because your heart, though wounded, was never corrupted. Because a mother who continues to love, even when she is mistreated, is a reflection of the divine. There was a long silence. The gentle, golden wind sighed. Your son, the voice continued, he will be touched as well. Not by my words, but by your example. And this animal you have trusted will be the witness and the bridge. For through him, justice and love will be revealed. The figure began to fade as the light grew brighter. The horse walked slowly towards Elspeth and rested its forehead against hers. A deep warmth flooded through her entire being, and then, suddenly, she was awake. The candle was still burning, but it was nearing its end. The sky outside was just beginning to lighten. Elspeth sat up on her mattress, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding but not with fear. She touched her chest and repeated in a small voice, it was real. It was real. She got up as best she could and went straight to the window. The horse was still there, in the exact spot she had seen him in her dream. Only this time, when he saw her, he raised his head and let out a soft, low whinny, almost as if to say, I told you so. Elspeth walked out of the house with slow but determined steps. She held her Bible in her hand, pressed against her chest. She stopped in front of the animal. You are no ordinary horse, she said to him, with a smile on her lips and tears in her eyes. You are an answer. A promise. A walking miracle. The horse moved closer and once again bowed its head, allowing her to stroke it as she had the night before. But this time, Elspeth wasn't crying from pain. She was crying from gratitude. And though she didn't know what was to come, she knew she was no longer alone. She knew that God hadn't forgotten her, and that this silent, faithful creature brought more than just companionship. It brought justice. It brought redemption. It brought hope. The sun was already high when Alistair Croft finally awoke. His mouth was dry, his head was heavy, and a foul mood clung to him like the dampness that clung to the cottage walls. Outside, the gulls were crying their usual song. Children were playing hopscotch in the lane, and the smell of wood smoke and frying bacon drifted from a neighboring house. But inside his room, the only thing he could breathe was a silent, thick tension, as if the very walls had grown tired of holding in so much unspoken rage. He pulled on the same wrinkled shirt that had been lying on the back of a chair and lumbered into the kitchen. He expected the smell of coffee, the one small comfort his mother prepared for him every morning since he was a boy. But he found no cup waiting for him, nor did he hear Elspeth's quiet voice saying, "Good morning, son." He found only a cold hearth and an empty table. He scowled. "Where is she?" he grumbled. He stomped out into the garden with heavy, angry steps, ready to unleash his fury. But what he saw when he stepped through the door stopped him dead in his tracks. Elspeth was sitting on a blanket spread on the ground, smiling, while the horse-that beast that had become his own personal, unsettling shadow rested its enormous head gently in her lap. The morning sun illuminated the scene, making it look like an ancient painting, one whose meaning Alistair could not decipher. There was something almost sacred about it. And that look on his mother's face, that gentle, serene, radiant smile, it was something he couldn't remember seeing in years. Maybe ever. "You're still here," he spat, directing the words not at his mother but at the horse. Elspeth looked up at him, but this time, there was no fear in her eyes. "Yes, he's still here. And it seems he has no intention of leaving." Alistair took a few steps closer. The horse calmly lifted its great head and fixed its gaze upon him. And that's when everything changed. Because this wasn't an ordinary animal's stare. It wasn't like the dumbed gaze of the farm horses or the wary look of a stray dog. This was a look that pierced right through him. A look that asked for no permission and needed no words. Alistair felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It was as if this animal knew everything about him, every shout, every cruel word, every night his mother had cried alone. It was as if it was seeing him completely naked, not his body, but his soul. "Don't you look at me like that, you dumb beast," he said in a low voice, clenching his fists. The horse didn't move. It just held his gaze, and that was somehow worse. Elspeth sensed the rising tension and struggled to her feet. "Alistair, he means no harm. He's not our enemy. And what would you know about it? Since when do you trust a stray horse more than your own son?" "I have never stopped trusting you," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "I just can no longer deny what is right in front of my eyes." Alistair took another aggressive step forward. The horse let out a low, rumbling snort, lowered its head, and positioned itself squarely between him and Elspeth, like a living, breathing wall. "Move!" Alistair shouted. The horse didn't budge. "I said, get out of the way." He raised his hand as if to strike it, to frighten it away, but he never made contact. In that instant, the horse rose up on its hind legs with a powerful, resounding neigh that echoed down the entire lane. Its body seemed to swell to the size of a giant. Its hooves pawed at the air with incredible force, and its eyes seemed to flash with a golden, otherworldly light. Alistair stumbled backwards, tripping over a loose stone and falling hard onto the ground. His heart was hammering against his ribs. Never, not once in his life, had he felt such a thing in the presence of an animal. Never had he felt so small, so utterly powerless. Elspeth rushed to his side as quickly as her old legs would allow. "Alistair, are you all right?" But he didn't answer her. He just stared up at the horse from the ground, his face pale and his breathing ragged. That gaze, those eyes, that powerful silence, it had broken through something deep inside him. He scrambled to his feet without a word, brushed the dirt from his trousers, and fled back into the house. The slam of the door was a sound of defeat. Elspeth stroked the horse's broad forehead and whispered, "Thank you, my boy. Thank you for not letting him pass." Alistair didn't come out of his room for the rest of the day. He didn't eat, he didn't speak. He just lay on his bed, feeling a pressure in his chest that couldn't be silenced with anger or alcohol. It was guilt. A guilt he had kept buried for years. And now, The look in that horse's eyes had dragged it out from the depths where he had hidden it. What kind of animal is that, he thought, his mind racing. How can it make me feel this without saying a word? But deep down, in a place he rarely visited, he knew the answer. It wasn't a common animal. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a judgment. It was a mirror. It was a warning. And Alistair Croft, though he would never admit it, was afraid. Meanwhile, outside, the horse returned to its spot beneath the rowan tree, lay down, closed its eyes, and rested peacefully, as if it knew its mere presence had done what no sermon, no advice, and no punishment had ever managed to do. It had cracked the wall around a hardened heart. It was a Thursday, and just like every Thursday, the mobile grocery van was making its rounds, its cheerful horn echoing through the quiet lanes. The ladies of Port Blossom were sweeping their doorsteps, and the children were playing with skipping ropes in the fleeting patches of shade. Everything seemed normal, except for one detail that had become the talk of the town. The mysterious grey horse had not moved from the garden of old Elspeth Croft. Very early that morning, Mrs. Gable, who lived across the lane, came out to hang her laundry. But instead of focusing on her bedsheets, she found herself staring at the cottage opposite. "He's still there," she muttered to herself, with a mixture of awe and reverence, as if she were looking at a living statue. The horse, lying peacefully beneath the rowan tree, calmly raised its head. It seemed to know it was being watched, and its presence was magnificent not because it was aggressive but because of something else, something no one could quite name, but that everyone felt. A sense of peace and of power. Later that day, Mr. Finn, the elderly man who ran the grocery van, pulled up outside the cottage. "Mrs. Croft," he called out from over the gate. "I've brought you a little seed cake." Elspeth came out, her cardigan neatly buttoned and a new expression on her face. She seemed to stand taller, more composed, and the dullness had faded from her eyes. "Oh, that's very kind of you, Mr. Finn, but I'm afraid I don't have much to offer you today." "Don't you worry about that, my dear. It's a gift. For you and for him." Elspeth looked at the animal, which at that moment rose and walked with slow, deliberate steps to stand beside her, as if it understood the conversation. "He's not mine," she said, with a soft smile. "But I don't think he belongs to anyone on this earth. I think he's come from heaven." Mr. Finn instinctively made the sign of the cross. "Well, I wouldn't be surprised. With that look he gives you, it's like he's staring right into your soul. I swear, even the stray dogs give him a wide berth." And it was true. Since the horse had arrived, not a single dog had barked at it, no child had thrown a stone in its direction. Even the cats, who usually patrolled the rooftops with brazen indifference, now seemed to avoid that particular cottage with a kind of feline reverence. A little later, Mrs. Gable plucked up the courage to cross the lane and approach the gate. "May I come in, Elspeth?" she asked in a small voice, as if she were about to enter a church. "Of course, Martha, come in." "He doesn't bite," Elspeth replied, gesturing to the horse. Martha approached slowly, her eyes never leaving the animal. "I dreamed of him last night," she said suddenly. Elspeth looked at her in surprise. "You did?" "I dreamed he was standing before me, but it wasn't him. It was as if an angel was standing in his place. And he told me it was time for us to stop looking the other way, that your pain would no longer be invisible." Elspeth felt a tightening in her chest. Her eyes grew moist. I had the same dream. And I was told the same thing. That this horse is an instrument, and not just for me. So I'm not going mad. No, Martha. I think we're just waking up. The two women looked at each other, and without another word they embraced. The horse let out a soft, low whinny, as if giving its blessing. That same day, more people came to the gate. Some with caution, others with open curiosity. Some brought fruit, others brought wild flowers. Others simply stood and watched in silence, as if it were a temporary shrine. A young lad from the neighborhood, Tobias, who was only 18, approached with his guitar slung over his shoulder. Could I play a song for him? He asked Elspeth nervously. If you play from the heart, son, I am sure he'd like that. Tobias sat on a low stone wall and began to pluck a soft, ancient melody from the strings, a tune his grandmother used to sing to him as a child. And the horse, the great grey horse, closed its eyes and stood perfectly still, as if it were listening, as if it understood. At the sight of this, more neighbors gathered. The same people who once barely greeted each other were now sharing a flask of tea on the pavement. The children who used to squabble over marbles were now playing quietly near the gate. The women who once only whispered behind cupped hands were now praying together softly. And at the center of it all was Elspeth, woman who had once walked with a permanent stoop, who had barely left her own home, was now a figure of serene strength, someone people sought out to talk to share a moment of peace with, to ask for a quiet word of advice. It wasn't fame, it was respect. A respect she had earned not with shouting or demands, but with a pain lived in silence and a dignity that no abuse could ever extinguish. And everyone knew it. They knew something sacred was happening there. No one dared say it out loud, but many began to speak of a miracle, of divine intervention, of heavenly justice. A few cynics insisted it was just a particularly unique horse, but even they lowered their voices when they passed the cottage, because everyone, without exception, felt that something inside them was beginning to change, too. Elspeth saw it, she felt it, but she took no credit. She was only grateful. "Thank you, Lord," she would whisper each night as she closed her eyes. "If this animal is your way of showing me that you still see me, then I have no words, only gratitude." And all the while, inside his room, Alistair, locked in the prison of his own thoughts, heard the growing murmur of voices outside. He heard the greetings, the laughter, the singing. He heard his mother's name on the lips of people who had not dared to speak it for years. And something inside him was cracking, something was shifting. Because the world he had spent years ignoring was now turning its gaze upon the very woman he had scorned. And the horse was still there, silent, but more present than ever. The sky was veiled in low, heavy clouds that morning, as if the entire village were holding its breath. The gulls weren't crying their usual raucous chorus, and even the wind seemed to drag itself timidly through the trees. Oat blossom awoke to an airy silence. It wasn't a Sunday, but there was a strange stillness in the air, as if the world knew something was about to break. Alistair Croft hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 days. He barely ate. He didn't go out into the garden. He avoided looking out the window, but from his room, he could hear everything, the singing, the visitors, the hushed whispers of people who came to look at the horse as if it were a messenger from another world. And what bothered him more than anything was the sound of his mother's laughter. A soft, gentle laugh that had been choked silent for years was now ringing out again. And it wasn't for him. He, who had grown up carrying his resentments like stones in his chest. He, who had learned to shout instead of cry, to strike instead of embrace. He, who as a little boy had begged his mother not to leave him alone in the dark, now hid from her gaze. Because her eyes were no longer weak. They were steady, clear, and they judged him without saying a single word. That afternoon, the sun didn't emerge at all. The sky remained overcast, and the air smelled of damp earth, though no rain had fallen. Alistair couldn't take it anymore. He shot up from his bed as if possessed, pulled on his boots without socks, and stormed out of the house without looking at anyone. Elspeth, who was washing some cups at the sink, saw him go. "Where are you going, son? Are you all right?" He yelled something back, but his words were lost in the wind. Elspeth watched him stride away, her heart clenching. She knew something inside him was finally breaking. And when a soul breaks, it either shatters completely or it is saved. Alistair walked along the muddy track that led out of the village, past the old abandoned cannery, and lost himself among the gorse bushes and wind-swept hawthorn trees. He walked with no destination, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes burning with a furious cocktail of rage and shame, his jaw locked tight, as if biting back the storm that raged within him. When he reached a desolate, empty field where his grandfather had once tried to grow potatoes, he fell to his knees and he screamed. He screamed as he had never screamed in his life. It wasn't a scream of anger. It was a scream of pure, undiluted pain. Of emptiness. Of years of accumulated guilt. He wept, his face pressed into the damp earth, beating the ground with his fists as if the world itself could take the punishment he deserved. Why, God? Why give me a mother so good when I am nothing but dirt? Why can she still love when I can't? Why did I become this? His sobs were so deep the birds in the nearby bushes fell silent. And there, surrounded by his own tears and the mud, the memories came at him like knives. Elspeth, cooking for him with such care. Elspeth, singing him lullabies. Elspeth, tending to his scraped knees. Elspeth, selling her own wedding ring to buy him his first proper fishing boots. And he had repaid her with contempt, with imprisonment, with shouts. What kind of a son was he? The wind picked up suddenly, swirling the dry leaves around him, and then, without knowing how, he felt a presence behind him. He turned. It was the horse. Alone. It had followed him without being led, without being called, for no logical reason. The animal just stood and looked at him from a distance. And that look, it wasn't just any look. It wasn't curious or fearful. It was deep, almost human. A look that didn't condemn but didn't absolve either. Alistair collapsed back onto the ground, this time in silence. "You know what I did," he whispered, his voice choked. "You saw everything, didn't you?" The horse took a few slow, calm steps towards him. It stopped a few yards away, it did not approach any closer. Alistair bowed his head. "I'm not even worthy of you looking at me." And that's when he felt it. Not a touch, not a sound, but a feeling. A sense of peace. A peace that didn't come from the air, or the sky, or the field. It came from within, as if something heavy had just been lifted from his chest, as if he could finally breathe without the weight of his own guilt. For the first time, Alistair didn't feel rage towards his mother. He felt a profound fear that he would never get the chance to ask for her forgiveness. He got to his feet, his legs trembling, his soul laid bare. The horse turned and began to walk back the way it had come, slowly, as if it knew he would follow. And he did. Alistair walked behind it in silence. They passed the old cannery, the rocks where he used to play as a boy, the hawthorn trees his father had planted before he was lost to the sea. And when they reached the edge of the village, it was already getting dark. The lights in the cottages were coming on. The smell of baking bread mixed with the murmur of families having their supper. Everything was the same as always. But for Alistair, nothing would ever be the same again. When he walked through the gate of his own home, his mother was there, waiting for him, her Bible in her lap. He said nothing. He simply knelt before her, and for the first time in his adult life, he wept in her lap, just as he had when he was a little boy. There were no words, only tears. And a forgiveness that didn't need to be asked for, because it had already been given. And the horse stood nearby, a silent guardian, as if closing a circle, as if its sacred mission was now complete. The next morning, the sun rose gently. It didn't emerge with force or haste, rather, its light seemed to arrive with the knowledge that this was a day that required not intensity, but tenderness. The sky, clear for the first time in days, was painted a pristine blue, so clean that even the distant hills could be seen in sharp detail. On Cliff Lane, in front of the stone cottage where Elspeth Croft lived, something was different. Something in the air, in the atmosphere, in the way the neighbors greeted each other as they passed. Everything felt lighter, more vibrant, more human. Inside, Alistair opened the cottage windows. He did it quietly, with clumsy, unpracticed movements, as if he had never in his life had to let the light in with his own two hands. The sun streamed in, filling corners that had remained in shadow for years. His hair was combed, he wore a clean shirt, and his eyes, at last, dared to look straight ahead. In the kitchen, Elspeth placed two simple clay plates on the table, a small dish of fried potatoes, some warm oatcakes wrapped in an embroidered cloth, and a small piece of cheese a neighbor had brought her the day before. "Would you like some tea, son?" she asked, her voice soft. "Yes, mother. But let me. You've done enough." Elspeth glanced at him from the corner of her eye. Her face was a canvas of surprise mixed with a love so vast it couldn't be contained. She watched him go to the hearth, light the fire with care, and handle the old clay teapot as if it were something sacred. That gesture, that simple, gentle gesture, was everything she had dreamed of for years. "Is this sweet enough?" he asked, pouring the tea awkwardly. "Yes, Alistair. It's perfect." They sat at the table in silence. Not a tense silence, but a peaceful one. The silence of two people who knew they had nothing left to hide. Outside, the dapple grey horse ambled across the garden with a slow, easy pace. It no longer lay under the rowan tree as before. Now it seemed to move with a quiet restlessness, as if it knew its presence was no longer needed for protection, but simply to accompany a new beginning. After their breakfast, Elspeth got up, went to an old wooden chest in her room and took out a tablecloth she had stored away for years. It was white, embroidered with pale blue flowers, a gift from her own mother on her wedding day. She shook it out carefully, spread it over the small table in the garden, and placed upon it a white candle, a small picture of Saint Christopher, some freshly picked wildflowers, and a glass of clear water. "What are you doing, mother?" Alistair asked from the doorway. "An altar. Not to pray for what we've lost, but to give thanks for what we still have." Alistair didn't reply. He just nodded, his eyes glistening. That afternoon, many neighbors came by, some with baskets of bread, others with flasks of hot soup. A woman from the village brought a string of prayer beads. Two small children brought drawings they had made of the horse, giving it huge wings as if it were a celestial being. Everyone wanted to share something, not just for Elspeth, but for the story that had awakened them. One of the oldest men in the village, old Mr. Hemlock, approached Alistair directly. "I knew your father, lad. He was a stubborn man, but a good one. You've got it in you to be one too. Don't let the good in you slip away again." Alistair bowed his head, deeply touched by the words. And that night, in front of the makeshift altar, Alistair knelt for the first time in years. He didn't do it out of obligation, he did it out of necessity, out of faith, out of a desperate need for redemption. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Mum," he whispered. "And thank you for not hating me when I deserved it most." Elspeth, with tears in her eyes, stroked his head, just as she had when he was a child. "I never hated you for a single day, my son. I just waited for you." The horse, standing a few feet away, watched them in silence. And then, as if it sensed deep in its soul that its work was done, it turned and began to walk towards the dirt track that led out of the village. Elspeth stood up. "He's leaving." "What do you mean, he's leaving?" Alistair asked, rushing to her side. They both walked to the gate. The horse was already some distance away. It didn't look back. It didn't whinny. It didn't run. It just followed the path, calm and resolute, as if it knew its mission was complete. "What do we do now, Mum?" Alistair asked, his voice breaking. Elspeth looked at him and took his hand. "Now, son," she said, her voice firm and clear. "Now we live." And so it was. That day was marked in the heart of Port Blossom as a dawn that was quieter and yet more miraculous than any the village had ever witnessed. There were no lights from the sky, no bolts of lightning, no angels with trumpets. There was a horse, a son, a mother, and a God who, in his infinite love, had chosen the simplest of things to manifest the sacred. The days turned into weeks, and what began as a hushed whisper among neighbors eventually became the most cherished story in Port Blossom. It started one Sunday morning when a group of young people from the village, led by Tobias, the same lad who had played his guitar for the horse, gathered in front of Elspeth Croft's cottage with tools in hand, planks of weathered driftwood, paint, and old nails. They didn't say much. They just smiled respectfully, took off their caps, and got to work. Elspeth watched them from her rocking chair by the gate, her burgundy cardigan neatly arranged, her face bright. At her side, Alistair observed in silence, his arms crossed, his heart so full it felt like it might overflow. "What are they doing?" he asked, not fully understanding. "An altar, my friend," Tobias replied with a broad smile. "But not for saints or candles. This is to remember what we witnessed here, so that no one forgets." They built it in the very spot where the horse used to lie beneath the old rowan tree. They hammered the wood together with patient hands, sanded the edges with care, and in the center, they placed a hand-carved sculpture of a horse with strong legs and a bowed head, as if in reverence. The figure wasn't perfect, it had cracks and rough details, but it was profoundly alive and real. Beneath the figure, they carved in crooked but heartfelt letters, "Heaven was silent, but faith remained on this earth." The altar soon became a meeting point. People brought wild flowers, homemade bread, and candles. Some knelt in silence, others simply left a written note or a single tear. But all of them, without exception, left with a lighter soul. The story spread like the wind to the neighboring villages. It reached the ears of a woman from a town miles away, who came with her son in a wheelchair just to see the place where God had sent a horse to save a mother. A schoolteacher brought his students and read them the story in front of the altar, teaching them that faith doesn't always come in the form of loud miracles, but in quiet, hidden acts of love. Elspeth, who had once been ignored, was now lovingly called the Lady of the Miracle. But she, with her unwavering humility, always said the same thing. "It's not my story. It is the story of everyone who has ever felt that no one was watching, but who kept loving anyway." On Sundays after church, people no longer went straight home. Many would divert their path just to walk down Cliff Lane, to stop before the wooden altar, and to take a deep breath. Some of them would talk to the horse as if it could hear them, as if it were still there, an invisible guardian watching over the town from just beyond the wind. And perhaps it was. More than one person claimed to have dreamed of him. Some said they saw him on the hills, moving between the trees. Others swore they heard his whinny at dawn, at the exact moment they needed to hear it most. But Elspeth needed no proof. She knew. She knew that the horse had been sent not just for her, but to awaken all the sleeping, hardened, and broken hearts. She knew that sometimes God doesn't send lightning or thunder, He sends silence. And in that silence was an animal that seemed simple, but that carried all of heaven within it. One afternoon, while sweeping the garden, Elspeth paused in front of the altar. She touched the wood with her trembling fingers and murmured, "Thank you for coming. And thank you for leaving when I no longer needed you." Alistair, who heard her from the doorway, bowed his head in respect. He was not the same man. He now walked slowly, but with a steady purpose. He spoke little, but with meaning. He cared for his mother as one cares for a fragile treasure. And every night, before he slept, he asked God for forgiveness, even though he knew he had already received it. The two of them, mother and son, continued to live together, no longer in silence, but in peace. And the village that had once closed its doors to another's pain, now opened its heart a little more easily. All thanks to a story that began with tears, continued with faith, and ended with love. But everyone tells the story a little differently. Some say it was a miracle. Others say it's a legend. But if you ever pass through Port Blossom, and you walk down Cliff Lane, you will see that wooden altar beside the rowan tree. And if you stand there in silence for long enough, maybe, just maybe, you'll hear a whinny in the distance. Or maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe it's God reminding you that He always finds a way to reach you even through a horse. Thank you so much for staying until the end of this incredibly profound and special story. If it touched your heart, if it made you think of someone you love, or if it reminded you of the power of faith and true forgiveness, then this video has fulfilled its purpose. But now I want to ask you something. From my heart to yours. Who have you been overlooking lately, even though you know they deserve your kindness? Is it possible that in your own life, a sign has arrived from heaven and you haven't taken notice? What would you do differently if you knew you still had time to change? The story of Elspeth and Alistair isn't just meant to move you, it's meant to inspire you to act, to reconcile, to look with new eyes at the people around you, and to remind you that miracles do exist, but often they arrive in silence. If this story made you reflect, please let me know in the comments. Do you believe that animals can be messengers from a higher power? Has anything similar ever happened to you? I would love to read your stories. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and activate that little bell so you don't miss any more stories that heal, that open the soul, and that remind us that God always finds a way to touch us even through a horse. We'll see you in the next video. And remember, nothing is impossible, some things just take a little longer. God bless.